The Silent Race of Carcosa. Part 3. Trials of the City. The oppressive quiet of Carcosa weighed heavily on Nyle as he continued his deliberate pace through the labyrinthine streets. The city was merciless, its shifting nature designed to confuse and ensnare, and those who moved too quickly found themselves caught in its traps. Nyle had learned this well after witnessing the fate of the man who had rushed into the shadows. With every step, Nyle could feel the weight of the city pressing in on him. The ancient stones seemed to hum with a faint energy, and the symbols carved into the walls pulsed with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic, like blood long dried on ancient ruins. But Nyle kept his focus sharp. He couldn't afford to let his mind wander, not in a place like this. Ahead, the street opened up into a narrow passageway that twisted into the fog. The symbols etched into the walls were different here, more intricate, more alive. Nyle paused to study them, his fingers brushing over the carvings. They seemed to move slightly beneath his touch, as though reacting to his presence. Suddenly, a soft sound, barely audible, reached his ears. A whisper, carried on the wind. Nyle froze, listening intently. The whisper was faint, but persistent, a chorus of overlapping voices, too indistinct to make out clearly. He knew better than to follow the sound directly, but it was difficult to ignore. The city was full of these illusions, distractions meant to lure the impatient to their doom. Nyle kept moving, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of stability. The stones beneath his feet were uneven, and every so often the ground shifted slightly, like the pulse of a living creature. He had to remind himself that Carcosa was not a city like any other. It was a place caught between reality and dreams, and it followed no natural rules. The passageway led him into an open courtyard, and for a moment, Nyle's breath caught in his throat. The courtyard was vast, larger than it should have been, given the size of the narrow streets he had just traversed. At its center stood a strange structure, a low stone table surrounded by tall, thin obelisks that stretched into the sky like twisted fingers. The air here was colder, and the mist clung to the ground like a living thing. But it was what stood beside the stone table that made Nyle stop. Varro. He stood there, his arms crossed, an arrogant grin plastered on his face. He seemed completely at ease, as if the dangers of Carcosa were nothing more than an amusing distraction to him. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Varro called out, his voice echoing slightly in the empty courtyard. "Thought you might have gotten lost, moving as slow as you do." Nyle narrowed his eyes but said nothing. He could see from the way Varro stood that he hadn't learned the same lessons. His body language was full of confidence, but also impatience. Varro wasn't the type to take his time. He was reckless, always charging ahead without thinking about the consequences. "What are you doing here?" Nyle asked, keeping his distance. The courtyard felt wrong, like it was watching them. Varro shrugged, glancing around with a bored expression. "Waiting for you, I guess. Thought I'd see if you'd figured out that this place isn't as dangerous as everyone says. The key is just to keep moving. I don't know why everyone else is so afraid." Nyle frowned. "Have you seen the others?" Varro's smirk faltered slightly. "Some of them. I passed a few on the way here. Looked like they were stuck in some kind of puzzle. Waste of time, if you ask me." Nyle's gut twisted. He had already seen what happened to those who rushed ahead, ignoring the warnings of the city. But Varro didn't seem to care. "Let me guess," Varro continued, walking toward the stone table at the center of the courtyard. "You're going to tell me I should slow down, take my time, right?" Nyle watched him carefully, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "I think this city punishes those who aren't careful," he said slowly. "I've seen what happens to people who rush through without paying attention." Varro laughed. "Yeah, well, that's their problem. You don't win races by standing still." He reached the stone table and ran his hand over its surface. Nyle's eyes were drawn to the obelisks surrounding it. There was something about them that felt off, but he couldn't place it. The mist around the base of the obelisks seemed to swirl in unnatural patterns, and the symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the whispers in the air. Nyle took a cautious step forward. Varro, don't. Before he could finish, Varro slammed his hand down on the center of the stone table. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the ground beneath the table shifted violently. The obelisks trembled, their thin, spindly forms bending unnaturally as the symbols carved into them flared to life, glowing with a blinding light. The mist thickened, swirling around the base of the obelisks like a living entity, and the whispers in the air grew louder, more insistent. Varro stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock. What? What's happening? Nyle didn't respond. He was already moving, backing away from the table as quickly as he could without losing his focus. The courtyard was coming alive, its stone walls shifting and warping as the mist curled up from the ground like a serpent. The whispers grew louder, no longer indistinct. Now they were clear, a cacophony of voices speaking in an ancient, unknown tongue. Nyle could feel the pressure building in the air, a force that pressed down on him from all sides. "Varro, get back!" Nyle shouted, but it was too late. The obelisks, which had been trembling and bending, suddenly straightened with a deafening crack. The symbols etched into them flared with an intense, white-hot light, and the mist surged upward, engulfing Varro in a thick cloud. Varro let out a scream of pure terror as the mist wrapped around him, pulling him toward the stone table. His body contorted, twisted by the unseen force, and his voice was drowned out by the roar of the whispers. Nyle watched in horror as Varro disappeared into the mist, his form swallowed by the shadows. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The courtyard fell silent. The mist receded, sinking back into the ground, and the obelisks returned to their previous positions, their glow fading into a faint, pulsing light. The stone table stood untouched, as though nothing had happened. Varro was gone. Nyle stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should have stopped Varro, should have warned him more forcefully. But he also knew that Varro wouldn't have listened. His arrogance had blinded him to the dangers of Carcosa, and now he had paid the price. Taking a deep breath, Nyle turned away from the courtyard. He couldn't stay here any longer. The city was testing him, trying to see if he would fall into the same traps as the others. But he wasn't like Varro. He knew better than to rush ahead without thinking. As he made his way back to the narrow streets, Nile's mind raced with thoughts of the remaining competitors. How many of them were still moving forward? How many had already been claimed by the city's illusions? The whispers in the air had faded, but the memory of them lingered in Nile's mind. They were a warning, a reminder that Carcosa was not a place for those who moved without caution. The city would continue to shift, continue to test him. But Nyle was determined to survive, no matter how long it took. This concludes Part 3 of The Silent Race of Carcosa. Stay tuned for Part 4, where Nyle faces a temptation that could alter his fate, and the dangers of rushing ahead become more apparent. If you enjoyed this part of The Silent Race of Carcosa, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. New stories are released on Mondays and continue Tuesday through Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific Time, only on the Lantern's Light. Where dreams and reality blur, adventure awaits in the shadows.